Please tell me how on earth you can explain the world debt or the amount of debt worldwide being north of 51 trillion 772 billion 300 million dollars. How can anybody explain that? I seriously don't know what people think is going on here. I mean, there's no excuse for that. Where is all that money? Basically, in 1910, this group of bankers met on Jekyll Island in secret, most notably the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and the Morgans, who are three of the very, very key players in this game. And then in 1910, they drafted the legislation, which in 1913 became the Federal Reserve. Now, this is what's very important to catch on to, because through this system of fractional reserve banking, they literally profit off of our debt increasing. So as the inflation grows, which is just debt, the inflation is just this massive pool of debt. So as the inflation grows and we're forced to compete with each other to try to get enough money to get what we need to survive, because there's not enough money in the money supply to go around or to pay back any of the massive amounts of debt that are owed to the banks literally profit off of handing out more loans, which increases the debt and increases the inflation rate. So you have us financially enslaved by debt, while the banks literally make money getting richer by handing out more loans, which increases our debt and increases the inflation rate and increases the wealth gap. So they profit, they make money, they get richer off of us getting poorer. And to understand that, you have to understand the nature of interest, because interest is the way this whole scam works, okay? So basically, the banks hand out a loan to whoever takes out that loan will then have to pay back the money that they were loaned plus an added interest rate. So they'll have to pay back the loan plus this extra fee to the banks for their wonderful services. Now the problem is the money to pay back that extra added interest rate doesn't exist in the money supply for them to be able to earn. It never existed. So there's this gigantic pool of debt. If there's only this gigantic pool of debt, how can anybody pay back what they owe to the banks? If the money doesn't exist, and the money never existed, then where does all the debt come from? Why is there so much debt? Who has all the money? Good question. The banks have all of the money. And why do they have all of the money? Because this is what they do. They hand out a loan. So then somebody owes them that loan back plus that added interest rate. But that added interest rate doesn't exist in the money supply for them to be able to earn. It never existed. But the banks, when they hand out a loan, they go ahead and type that money plus that added interest rate. They type it into their system as being their money, because it is owed to them, despite the fact that it hasn't actually been paid back to them yet. And then they hand out that money as loans to other people. So what that means is that they create the money out of thin air, because the money to pay them back and that added interest rate never existed in the money supply for them to be able to earn. It only came into existence the moment that they type it into their computer as being theirs, because it's owed to them, but it never existed in the public money supply prior to that. So that system builds on itself, okay? And it just creates this cycle of ever increasing debt, because the money can only flow in one direction. The inflation rate can only increase, which means we can only get poorer, and they continue to get richer off of our money and the money that they're creating out of thin air. And everybody's in debt to the banks and owes money to the banks, and the banks, the banking families, are the richest in the world, and nobody can pay back any of the money that they owe to the banks, because the banks have all the money that we would need if we were to even be able to pay them back in the first place.